Hello, my name's Anna Morris and I'm a solicitor here in the contentious probate team. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking to you about challenging a will. So, will challenge claims usually come about when somebody dies, their will is read and their relatives believe that something isn't quite right with it. It might be, for example, that they have two children and have inexplicably written one out of the will, or it could be that they have two children and have inexplicably written both out of their will and left their estate to Joe Bloggs down the road, who none of the family even know. There are a huge number of examples I could give, but this gives you an idea. I should probably first point out that in English law, people are perfectly entitled to leave their estate to whom they choose. That doesn't mean their estate wouldn't be subject to other possible claims, but I won't go into these here. Safe to say it's really important to seek legal advice and have your will professionally drafted to try to avoid your loved ones needing to deal with inheritance disputes when you die. If you want information about the other types of claims that could be made, we've got quite a lot of information on our website. But in England, there is no succession law requiring you to leave your estate to your children, for example. If you believe that there is something wrong with a will, you need to establish a ground upon which you can bring a challenge. If you are able to establish grounds for a challenge, then you may be able to prove that the last will is not valid and that an earlier will should be propounded, so sent to the probate registry as the last will. If there are no earlier wills, then you would be seeking to apply the intestacy rules. And it's worth thinking about whether you stand to inherit more under the earlier will or the intestacy rules before spending money on investigating a will challenge too. So the grounds that you can bring a will challenge on are as follows. The first one I'm going to deal with is the lack of proper formalities. So this means that it must have been properly executed by the deceased. There are a number of formalities which must be complied with when somebody executes their will, and these are all set out in law. These include things like the will being witnessed, but there are so many different rules. So again, it's really important to get help from a solicitor when making a will to ensure that you tick all the boxes, so to speak. The second ground I'm going to deal with is lack of capacity. This is quite a common ground and an issue we see regularly, especially now people are living longer and dementias appear to be more common, I think. To execute a will, you need to have what is known as testamentary capacity, which means you need quite a high level of understanding, including knowing what the will is, what effect making a will has on your estate, and what assets you have in your estate to dispose of. If the deceased lacked this when making their last will, then there is grounds for a challenge, or there may be grounds for a challenge, and there's usually a good record of testamentary capacity if a will was drafted by a solicitor, and medical records usually prove or disprove capacity quite well too. So that's where we'd be initially looking for some evidence for you. Next up, I'm going to deal with lack of knowledge and approval. So this relates to the testator knowing and approving the content of their will. If they didn't, then you've got ground for lack of knowledge and approval. We tend to see issues in this respect when a testator was blind, deaf, or maybe they didn't speak English as their first language, or didn't speak English at all and had an English will. That's not to say that deaf, blind, or non-English speakers can't make wills in England, but they would need to have it read to them or produced in Braille or larger font if they were blind, for example. Again, this is where a professionally drafted will usually stands up, because the drafter knows to make detailed notes to confirm that the testator knew and approved the content. For example, if the testator only spoke Chinese but had an English will, they might be able to evidence that they got a Chinese translator in to translate the will, so that they can prove that the testator did know what they were signing. And the last ground I'm going to deal with here is fraud or undue influence. Now, this one is quite a hard ground to bring a challenge on, and whilst often suspected, can be really hard to evidence. You might be able to claim fraud, for example, if you are able to prove that the will has been changed. So maybe you've got a copy and the executor's got a copy, but the middle page is different on both copies. And oh, look at that, the middle page they have leaves them the entire estate and writes you out. Equally, the beneficiary could have poisoned deceased minds, and if you can evidence that, you could potentially have a claim for a fraud challenge. Or in relation to undue influence, if you have very strong evidence that the beneficiary put pressure on the deceased to change their will, maybe by drafting a new will for them and standing over them to sign it or something along those lines, that could be grounds for a challenge on the basis of undue influence. But in these circumstances, I think there's quite often evidence of lack of capacity or lack of knowledge and approval. So these are safer grounds to be relied on if you've got those available to you. So that is a very brief whistle-stop tour of will challenge. It gives you some ideas of when they could be brought. It's not exhaustive, but if you do think that you may have grounds to challenge a will, please do get in touch with us and we will endeavour to help. Thank you.